Hi, in this lecture, we're going to learn more about connective tissues. Now, connective tissue is very different from epithelial for many reasons. Number one, connective tissue has scattered cells. Remember, epithelial has tightly packed cells. Connective tissue, most of them are going to be vascular, meaning they have a blood supply, where all epithelial was avascular. In fact, the only avascular connective tissue is cartilage, and we'll look at that later. Connective tissue is all throughout your body. It's the most abundant of all the tissues throughout your entire body, and they all start from some embryonic tissue called the mesenchyme. So the mesenchyme is an embryonic cell, and that cell is a stem cell or contains stem cells that can form all connective tissues. And the other thing with connective tissue that's different from epithelial is that connective tissue has a lot of matrix. We learned the matrix last lecture. We didn't talk about it yet because epithelial tissue, we don't look at matrix. There is no matrix, it's just cells. But connective tissue has a lot of matrix. So what are the functions? Well, as you can guess, it connects and binds and helps hold everything together. One type of connective tissue is like the packing peanuts of the body. It provides support and your structural framework. Your skeleton is connective tissue. It stores energy, it stores nutrients. In fact, adipose tissue is connective tissue. It helps transport materials. Blood is a connective tissue. And it helps protect us and helps with our immune system. So one way to think about this is to look at some of the cells we see in connective tissue. Now, first of all, on this slide, it's a little different from the last one. I do like it because I think you can see the different fibers a little bit better. Remember that the collagen fibers are pretty thick, the elastic are thinner, and the reticular are more branched. Okay, so we have these fibers, and all of these fibers are made by a fibroblast. So that cell is responsible for making all those protein fibers, which are part of the matrix. Now, blast at the end of the word means immature. So a fibroblast, the name tells you, it's a cell that makes fibers. It also makes some of that glue. So like that pink stuff that you see here in between the cells. So we talked about those gags last time, those sticky proteins. Another example is called hyaluronin. So it's this glue between the cells. So the fibroblasts are really, really important anytime your tissue you grow or you need to heal, right? Or repair tissue or heal from a wound. Now here's your adipocytes. They're basically big gobs of oil. They have a nucleus and not much else, and their job is to store fat. You have what are called mast cells. So mast cells are right here. They look kind of, see those little black dots? Now a mast cell and a basophil, which you may have heard of a basophil and a mast cell are the same thing. We call it a mast cell if it's in tissue, in connective tissue, and we call it a basophil if it's in your blood. And so both of these, same cell, they release two important chemicals called histamine and heparin. And you may have heard of these before. In fact, histamine and heparin are really important in the inflammatory response. And we'll be looking at that, I think it's the last lecture in this chapter. Now, phagocytes, you probably know there's a phagocyte, macrophages, right? They go around and they eat up things. So they eat debris, they eat up bacteria, virus-infected cells. So they're very important in protection. And then we have other white blood cells, which is known as a leukocyte. You may have heard of neutrophils and eosinophils. So these are cells that can do phagocytosis. They can release chemicals. They're very important in the defense of your body. So let's start looking at types of connective tissue that you're going to be learning. So we have what's called loose connective tissue. Usually we just say areolar or areolar. I don't care whichever way you want to say it. It's the most abundant of the connective tissues. Now, if you look at this, you'll see it's pretty unorganized. You see why it's called loose. So you have some fibers. See these collagen fibers, all these red fibers? So you have fibers and you have cells. Now, the main cell you're going to see are fibroblasts, but it has all the other cells we looked at. Usually when we look at histo, the fibroblasts come out pretty nice, and you see their nucleus. So I've got scattered cells, scattered fibers with lots of space in between. It almost looks like someone took a handful of cells and fibers and shook them up and threw them, and there's your loose tissue or your areolar connective tissue. Because there's so much space, this is where fluid accumulates. So edema is an increase in interstitial fluid, and that tends to happen in this tissue. So why do we have this tissue? Well, number one, holds your skin on. So you may have heard of your hypodermis, and I'm sorry, sitting on my floor and I'm not writing very neatly. So the hypodermis is what is going to basically hold your skin on, and we'll look at that in more detail in the next unit. It fills spaces around organs. This is the tissue I was talking about that works kind of like those packing peanuts. So it just kind of like pours in all around the organs. And it also helps surround and support blood and lymph. Now, if you look at dense, irregular, the first word tells you dense. So we're no longer loose, right? Loose was scattered, lots of space. Look at dense. Look at all those collagen fibers. Look at all those pink lines. So now we have a lot more fibers, but it's irregular. Do you see how they all go in different directions? So now we're going to be stronger because we have more fibers, but they're randomly oriented. So you can put force this way and this way and this way. So it makes it really good at resisting forces anytime you have pulling forces from many different directions. So this is in the dermis layer of your skin, so it makes sense. Think of everything you pull on your skin. It also surrounds cartilage and bone. So bones and cartilage have this covering around them called the perichondrium and the periosteum. Now, peri means around, and chond means cartilage, and you probably know osteo means bone. So dense or regular connective tissue surrounds all of your cartilage and your bones. And it also surrounds organs. A lot of times organs have what's called a joint capsule, which surrounds and protects them, and that's made from this tissue. Now look at dense regular. Dense irregular, regular. Notice lots, look at all that collagen. Lots of collagen. If you're looking at cells, they're going to be fibroblasts. It's still vascular. Because it has so much collagen, it's super strong. It's really, really strong. Now, it's going to resist force in only one direction. So you can tear it, right? You can tear these things. You can overstretch these things, and they're inelastic. So if you overstretch it, it doesn't go back to its original size. So dense, regular connective tissue is sometimes called white fibrous because of all the collagen fibers, it looks white. So if you've ever eaten meat, ever get a chicken breast, you'll see running right through it that tendon. So tendons and ligaments. Now, when we look at a tendon, you're going to have to know this soon anyway. Let me write tendons and ligaments. Okay, so tendons are part of your muscular system because tendons are going to connect muscle to bone, whereas ligaments are part of your skeletal system, and ligaments connect bones to bone. And we'll learn a few ligaments. They're usually named for the bones they connect. Now, fascia surrounds muscle. So fascia surrounds and holds all your muscle together. And then you have this big long word in your notes called an aponeurosis. And you can kind of see that here in the notes. An aponeurosis is just a really broad, flat tendon. And we see these mainly in our abdominal muscles. Now, elastic connective tissue looks really funky. It's just all these elastic fibers. You can kind of see how you could pull it and you'd expect it to spring back. So it will have some collagen fibers. You're going to need some strength in there, but it's really good for recoil. So, let me try to use a pen here. So if you stretch the tissue, it recoils. So this is in like your aorta, which is the largest artery in the body. When it stretches, it recoils. In fact, that's what sets up your pulse wave. So you can palpate a pulse. Your lungs, right? You breathe in and then you automatically recoil. Reticular has a lot of reticular fibers, which we said form that internal framework or network. So they tend to form like scaffolding or framework in organs like your liver, your spleen, your lymph nodes, bone marrow. Okay, adipose tissue, it just looks like gobs of oil, and sometimes you don't always see the nucleus. So the cell just fills up with oil and then pushes the nucleus off to one side. So its job is to store fat. Now, why do we need fat? Well, we do need fat, right? It's not pleasant always, but we need it. It provides padding and cushions us. It's shock absorption. It insulates us, right? Helps keep us warm, and it stores energy. Fat has a lot of energy, so it's very important, it has some functions. Now, what's interesting for the adipocytes, which is a fat cell, is they technically don't undergo mitosis throughout your whole life. They don't replicate. They usually replicate more in your infancy and childhood. But what they do is they get bigger and they shrink. So when you gain weight, your adipocytes fill up bigger, 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 bigger. And when you lose weight, they just shrink, but they're still there. So unless you go in and have liposuction or something and remove them. There is something called white fat and brown fat. So most of us we all have white fat. I'm trying to move my picture off the screen here. So white fat is your typical fat, but brown fat is very metabolically active. They call it brown fat because it looks a little darker because of all the mitochondria in it. And you might remember that mitochondria are going to make ATP. So it burns a lot of calories and produces a lot of fat. So you see this more often in babies to help them thermoregulate, but some people have more brown fat as they get older and they're going to have a higher metabolic rate. Now, I'm going to put my picture up there. As far as adipose tissue goes, as we talk about it, there's different places that we store our fat. We can store it under our skin, which is called subcutaneous fat. So like you pinch an inch, right? You can grab that underneath your skin. And then you have visceral fat. Now, visceral fat is deep organ fat. And so you might not even look like you're fat and have a lot of visceral fat. So we know that subcutaneous fat, it's not pleasant, but it's not as unhealthy for us as visceral fat. Because visceral fat, again, it's underneath your abdominal muscles. It causes a lot of health issues. We're finding that it increases inflammation, increases your risk of heart disease and diabetes. And so one thing you can do is do what's called your waist to hip ratio. So you measure your waist wherever the narrowest point is, and then you measure your hips at the widest point and divide the number of your waist by your hips. And you can see your number, and the higher the number, you might have heard before, but they talk about being an apple shape where your fat's on your belly fat, or being a pear where it's on your hips. It's worse to be an apple than a pear. And this fat can be very difficult to lose. So, it can be kind of a struggle if you have a lot of that. All right, we're going to talk about supportive connective tissues. And in supportive, we're looking at things that help support our body, carry our body weight. And the two types of supportive are cartilage and bone. So they have similar functions, and that they're both critical for supporting our body, but they're very different in their ground substance composition. Cartilage tends to have more like a gel-like ground substance, where bones is calcified. And if you see calcified, it means it's hardened or rigid. Now, cartilage helps with shock absorption and protection, but bone does protect, right? We have our skull protecting our brain and our thorax protecting our heart. So it does protect, but it's also much stronger for weight support. So we're going to look at cartilage first. And when we look at cartilage, again, it's going to have a matrix made by the cells. It's gel-like. And when we look at the cells, we see chondroblast and chondrocyte. So remember, blast means immature. So the chondroblast makes cartilage, and the chondrocyte maintains cartilage. So you can see the cells here. You can kind of see right here. I'll try to draw a little bit. You can especially see the nucleus. Let me try to use the pointer. And then you'll see this space around the cell. That space is called a lacuna, excuse me, or lacunae is plural. So the cell is inside its own little house, its own little space called a lacuna. The matrix has a lot of collagen and a lot of those sticky proteins. A lot of it comes from these chondroitin sulfates that you might, that you might have heard of before, these chondroitin sulfate. In fact, you may have heard of taking chondroitin sulfate or glucosamine chondroitin to help with cartilage. The jury's kind of out if that helps or not. But what happens is this matrix is very, very strong, but it's also pretty flexible as well. So it's a good combination material. Now, when we look at cartilage, because cartilage is avascular, and for whatever reason, the chondrocytes make this thing called anti-angiogenesis factor. So angiogenesis means to make blood vessels, but they make something that doesn't let blood vessels grow. That's why it's avascular. So they are dependent on that perichondrium. And we just mentioned it back in dense, irregular connective tissue. So the perichondrium surrounds the cartilage, has an outer fibrous area and an inner cellular layer. And this is the area that supplies the blood supply, and that if the cartilage cells do replicate, they replicate just inside of that. And I mentioned as far as being avascular, that also makes it really hard for cartilage to heal. So if cartilage is damaged, it might not heal, especially if it's damaged. Let me get a different color here really quick. if it's damaged on the inside. So in here is going to have less access to blood than out here. This layer is going to be more likely to heal faster. And in fact, we do know that since it doesn't heal really well, that it also stops growing, usually in adulthood. So it can be really tough if you have a cartilage injury for that to heal. Now, we talk about platelet-rich plasma therapy. I think I talk about it more in another chapter. I think in the next one we talk about tissue repair. But just know that what's kind of cool is that if you take blood and you spin it down, you're going to separate it out and you're going to get this platelets. And what we know is that this platelet, let me move my face again. Got to keep moving this. That this platelet therapy, so you take it from the patient. Okay, so you have a cartilage tear, and then when you remove it from the patient, you take this platelet, you inject it back into the injury site. In this case, it's the meniscus in the knee, and that the platelets have growth factors, and those growth factors are going to allow the repair to be much faster. A growth factor stimulates mitosis. So you can see all the different treatments they use with this, and it used to just be for professional athletes, but now it's for just us common folk. So types of cartilage. Hyaline cartilage, most abundant of all the cartilage. Classic hyaline cartilage, you see all that matrix there, that pink stuff, and then you can clearly see the clear lacunae with the cell inside. So you'll see lacunae, you'll see chondrocytes very easily. The hyaline cartilage, and again, it's kind of like scattered. See how it's scattered throughout the matrix? And I say it kind of looks like bubbles. Think of the lacuna as a bubble and the cells inside of it. And so it's very smooth and glass-like. It reduces friction. So it's very important at reducing friction. In fact, articular cartilage is the cartilage on the ends of bones. So that's what articular cartilage is, hyaline cartilage. It's a precursor to bone. As a fetus, you had a hyaline cartilage skeleton. It forms your nose, your costal cartilage, which is in your ribs, your trachea, your bronchi, your larynx. So hyaline cartilage. Now, fibrous cartilage, look at the difference now. Notice all these fibers, right? See all the fibers? Here it's just like a gel matrix. So fibrous or fibrocartilage is different in that it's lots and lots of fibers and bundles. So you still have lacunae and chondrocytes, but they're scattered because there's so many fibers. So this is like this is the original gel insert. It's compressible. It supports body weight. It's cushioning. So examples are the disc in your back, okay, your intervertebral disc that helps support your body weight. Your meniscus, you've probably heard of the knee cartilage. We just looked at that a little bit on the previous slide. And then you have cartilage between your pubic bones called your pubic symphysis. Now, if you look at elastic cartilage, that looks completely different. I always say that's the Ravens fan cartilage because it usually stays purple and black. This one looks a little more pink. Those elastic fibers tend to stain black. So you see lots of elastic fibers and lacunae and chondrocytes. So this is found in the pinna. Let me take this. I don't know if you can hear me. Take it off of your ear, right? The part of your ear that's pretty flexible. And also the actual vocal cords of your larynx because they have to move and vibrate to form speech. So that's cartilage. How is bone different? Well, bone's different in several ways. One, I told you that the matrix was hardened or calcified. So it's very hard and very strong. The other thing is bone is vascular. It has a blood supply. So bone matrix is made up of two things. You have the calcium and phosphate salts. That's the inorganic part because remember salts, minerals are not alive. And then you have the protein part. So they call that the organic, right? Organic molecules. And so you have this very hard, rigid material and you have these collagen fibers embedded in it. So it makes our bones very, very strong, but flexible. So if we look at bone cells, the three types we're going to look at right now are osteoblasts, osteoclasts, and osteocytes. Now, osteoblasts, as you can guess, these are cells that make bone, right? Their job is to actually manufacture and make bone. So we might say bone deposition because they're depositing new bone. They're going to be trying to get calcium, get that matrix made and calcium in. An osteoclast does the opposite. It breaks bone down. So the osteoclast is going to be, let me move my face again here. You can see these bigger guys. These osteoclasts are breaking bone down, so they're responsible for bone resorption. Osteocytes are a mature bone cell. They're in a lacuna. It's just like cartilage, a little space, but we don't always see it. And if we look at bone tissue, it looks a lot different than cartilage, doesn't it? It looks much more compact, much more dense. So if we were to look at the microscopic anatomy of it, we do know it's vascular, but we also know that it's very rigid and very hard. So we have to have a way to get the blood in. So the osteon is the basic unit of bone. And to me, it looks like a tree trunk. So there's an osteon here, there's an osteon here, there's an osteon here. And this is compact bone that we're looking at. This is spongy bone. We're not doing that right now. So compact bone is made up of osteons, and each osteon has specific structures. So one thing it has is right in the middle is the central canal. And you can see that spot here. I'll try to put my yellow, oh, that's not going to work. We'll use white. That is the central canal. The dark spot inside is where the blood comes in. Okay, so that contains the blood vessels. Then you have lamellae, and you have osteocytes and lacunae. Now, the lamellae, if I use this as a tree trunk example, in the center, right, is going to be my central canal. And then around it are rings of collagen called lamellae. So the collagen fibers run this way and this one, they run that way. So they run in opposite directions, so it gives it really good tensile strength and twisting strength. So each of these is a lamella, is singular, or lamellae is plural. So they're just rings of collagen. The osteocytes are the things that look like the little black dots here. They're in a lacuna, which you can't quite see, but because we need to get blood from the center all the way out, it's going to flow through tiny canals called canaliculi. And you can see in your notes and in this PowerPoint, I'll move this down a little bit, you can see that that blue arrow is trying to point at the canaliculi. So canaliculi are literally tiny canals, and their job is to transport blood from the central canal so it gets out to the osteocytes. Now remember, bone is surrounded by the periosteum. It surrounds the outside of bone. In fact, muscles are going to insert on it, and that's our dense irregular tissue. So I just showed you compact bone, which is very dense and strong like the tree trunks, but then you also have cancellous or spongy bone, and I don't care which way you call it. And look at this one, it has all kinds of spaces inside. So compact bone's always on the outside and spongy bone's on the inside. And we're going to talk more about that when we get to chapter 6. Okay, the fluid tissues. I told you that blood was a connective tissue, and it is. So blood, you might know, blood is made up of cells, which are called formed elements, and plasma. So you have the cells, and you have the matrix, which is the plasma. So the plasma is that extracellular matrix. Now, plasma is mostly water. Okay, so it has a lot of water, and it has some proteins that we just say are called plasma proteins, and then everything that's dissolved in your blood. Glucose, sodium, ions, nutrients, etc. The formed elements are the cells. So they're the living part. And there's 3 types of cells. So we have red blood cells that we say RBC. We have white blood cells, and we have platelets. So red blood cells, you saw these in Bio 119. They do not have a nucleus. So they always have a little white spot inside. And red blood cells actually transport oxygen and carbon dioxide. However, 98.5% of all oxygen is transported on a red blood cell. You might remember it has hemoglobin on it. So that's its main job. White blood cells, on the other hand, are part of your immune system. So we talked about them earlier. They can be phagocytes. They can release chemicals and do chemical warfare, so they're critical for that. Platelets help with blood clotting. The other fluid is lymph. And so lymph is going to have a lot of proteins. It actually comes from interstitial fluid. It has lymphocytes. You might have heard of T cells and B cells. Those are lymphocytes. And lymph is kind of like a white color because it contains a lot of fat. So it comes from your interstitial fluid. That's the fluid that surrounds and bathes cells. And it circulates in vessels that we call lymphatics. And lymph only travels one direction only, which is kind of interesting. All these and lymphatics are bringing lymph back to the heart. And so these are basically lymph veins, but we call them lymphatics. So just look at a couple pictures here of like, how are we going to tell which is which? Again, in connective tissue, I'm not looking at cell shape. I'm really looking at fibers and seeing how packed they are. So in this one, notice I see fibers are kind of spread all over. So take a second, maybe hit pause and see if you can identify these two tissues. In this one, notice I've got fibers spread and then I've got sporadic cells. It's very unorganized. So this is my areolar tissue. Now this one, look at all these fibers, lots and lots of fibers, and I have these kind of like spread out cells. Now it's not dense regular because it's not as uniform, and you might notice these spaces here, right? Those spaces are the lacuna. So if you see a white spot around the cell, that's the space. That's going to tell you it's probably cartilage because you don't really see a lacuna on bone. And if I narrow it down to cartilage, I look at the fibers. And this is thick fibers, lots of fibers together. So this is going to be my, you can call it fibrocartilage or fibrous cartilage. It doesn't matter to me. So that concludes our lecture on connective tissue.